Shana Tova, Happy New Year, listeners. Welcome to We Won, Let's Eat, the Jewish food podcast. It is almost time for Rosh Hashanah, which means we are talking about the most important part of your Rosh Hashanah dinner, apples and honey. I am Lonnie Goldsmith of TC Jew Folk, and I am joined by my co-hosts from Fancy Dinner Club, Matt Erickson and Bradley Maychov. Gentlemen.
Hello.
How are you?
Good.
Hungry.
I'm glad you're hungry because today is Apples and Honey Taste Test Day in the We Won Let's Eat studios, and we are 2 apples into our tastings. We have Granny Smith, Zestar, Macintosh, First Kiss, Honeycrisp, and I can't remember what the other apple is.
That's a problem.
Sweet Tango.
There we go.
Sweet Tango. We have apples. We are sponsored this week. We have a sponsor. Bear Honey is sponsoring this episode. We have all manner of honey from Bear Honey at bearhoney.com. We're going to talk about the honey and the apples and what we think works well together for your Rosh Hashanah table. And so we are 2 apples in so far. And what are we thinking right now?
So we've tried the Granny Smith and the Zestar. And any day of the week, I would tell you I only want a Granny Smith if it's baked into a pie or an apple crisp or something else. And I would gladly sit down and eat a Zestar. It's my favorite apple after the Honeycrisp. But I've kind of gotten a little mind warped here. This honey's so good that I don't want an apple that overpowers it. The Granny Smith was a perfect vessel for the honey.
Yeah, the honey is the star of the show here. As good as the apples are, I'm digging all of these honeys. The only thing with me is I just think that the Granny Smiths work better with the honeys because it's less of a flavor. The honeys shine through more. But I don't necessarily want an apple with less flavor. I want a good apple. The problem is the Zestar was too much because you couldn't really taste the honey. It drowned it out. So I'm hoping that one of these apples that are still to come are more of a Goldilocks, where you get a good apple and you can taste the honey.
So the honeys that we've gotten from Brett Van Ness, the owner of Bear Honey, there is wildflower honey, like raw wildflower honey, the Minnesota clover honey, which when we talk to Brett, we're going to talk to him a little bit about the Minnesota clover because it looks nothing like honey. And that was, Matt, one of the first things that you said. You held it up to the quince blossom and the linden blossom that he sent with us also to taste with. The Minnesota clover doesn't look like what you expect the honey to look like.
No, not at all. It's kind of pale, which I'm guessing changes from year to year based on just what's going on in our environment. But before I heard the interview with Brett, I would never have pulled that off the shelf. I wouldn't have known any better.
Yeah.
Right? We're all conditioned to think honey is this golden color. And I'm telling you right now that clover honey is special.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
I think it worked great with both apples.
Yeah.
And I think the sunflower honey really, it really grew on me that on that second bite. And I think the biggest problem I've had so far is the apple, is that the Zestar it's a lot of apple, and it's a great flavor if you want to just sit at the table and eat an apple. Mm-hmm. It's perfect. That's a perfect apple. But for purposes of Rosh Hashanah and this experiment, which we are painstakingly going through for you, our listener, this is somebody's got to do it though, right?
It's tough work.
It's tough work. But
someone's got to do it. And we're happy to sacrifice on your behalf.
We'll take one for the team, and that's the beauty of this podcast is we taste all the foods, the Jewish foods that we all love. We're going to sacrifice for you, the listener, because that's how much we value you.
So let's cut up some more apples and try some more apples and honey. And while we do, why don't we throw it to Brett and learn more about all of his honey and how it works?
We are here with Dustin Van Ness of Bear Honey. Thank you for sponsoring this episode of the podcast, and thank you for getting to talk a little honey with us today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you for coming in and talking to us.
So, obviously, Rosh Hashanah, the apples and honey holiday, if you will. And generally speaking, people know how honey gets made, right? Bees pollinate, from the
Yeah.
hives?
Yeah.
How does that?
So there's lots of things that bees do. One thing is pollinate, and that might be the most important thing for all of our survival, really. But the byproduct of that pollination is that they collect nectar from the plants. This is how the plants entice them to come to the flower to spread the pollen around. So the bees will collect nectar from those flowers. They bring it back to the hive, and they desiccate it or they dry it out. So when they collect the nectar, it's upwards of 90% water. But when you eat honey, it's less than 20% water. And so they, through a process with enzymes and fanning it and evaporating the water out of the nectar, you end up with the honey that we all know.
How do honeys get their sort of unique characteristics, and what makes them all different?
Yeah. Honey's kind of like saying fruit. Every fruit has its own flavor, its own color. Every fruit comes from a flower. And so those flowers have their own flavor and color of nectar as well. In Minnesota, we have everything from like the deep, dark, black buckwheat honey from our buckwheat pollination up towards North Dakota that has a deep molasses, earthy tones to it, to the super light white clover honey that we just harvested. Actually, I think there's some pictures on our Facebook page, and that it's almost water white in color, so there's a slight tinge to it, and it tastes super floral, like if you can imagine the smell of a field of clover. That's what it smells like or tastes like. We also get a small amount of apple blossom nectar that has the flavor of the smell of the blossom of the apple. It doesn't taste like apples, but it has the flavor of the smell of the blossom, so it's kind of interesting. Dandelion honey is another one that's in Minnesota that's like that also, that we get in the spring at small amounts. And there's several others along the way. Every time of the year has a slightly different flavor to it, depending on where your hives are. In the river valleys around Minnesota, we get what's called linden blossom or basswood honey. It has a very herbaceous flavor to it, and when we harvest it from the hive, it almost has a green tinging color from it.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
So not all honey is sort of created equally then.
Right. Yeah.
If you think of it that way.
That's something we say often. Is like, not all honey's created equal. But then it comes down to personal opinion. Also, everybody likes their certain honeys for certain things. I have a different honey for everything that I do at home. Whether it's making whipped cream, which is great with honey, brings the whole land of milk and honey thing. Right. It actually makes it
Yeah,
true. It's like,
true.
I understand this now. Like, we never use sugar in our whipped cream anymore because it tastes so good with our honey.
So it sort of leads me into my next question of how do you think food and honey can be paired together? I know people think about how food and wine, food and beer are different spirits, but it sounds like you probably have some recommendations of how honey can be paired with different foods in different ways too.
Oh yeah, for sure. So honey has a lot of practical uses in the kitchen. Honey's one of the interesting things is it's an emulsifier, so it holds two unlike things together longer. So if you think of vinegar and oil in a dressing, using a honey as a binding agent will actually hold your dressings together for longer and provide more flavor. It also has a slight umami-ness to it, and so that it can bring out the flavor of other things. If you think of MSG is probably the most popular thing that brings out the flavor of other things, right? Honey can do it in the same way, but it brings out the kind of the sweet nuances and flavors in other products as well. And as I was saying earlier, the different honeys have different flavors to them, and so we often match them with specific products. And we actually have a line of honeys that we add spices to and crystallize in a way that's creamy and spreadable, but we use very specific nectar sources for each different blend that we make that pairs well with that spice, so it brings the flavor of the spice out. Like we have the cinnamon honey, and one type of nectar source brings the flavor of the cinnamon out in a nice floral way, whereas most other honeys that we used with that when we were experimenting with the different products actually dampened the flavor of the cinnamon. So different honeys have different properties.
Well, that's really neat. Now, do different batches in a particular year taste different from batch to batch of the same type of honey?
Yeah, it does. And the reason that is because in Minnesota in particular, we have many biennial plants. And so a biennial plant is a plant that grows one year and it doesn't grow in the same place the next year. Okay. And because of that, and where our placement of our hives are, if they're the same from year to year, often the honey will change in flavor. And as I was talking about the different flavors from different plants, there are certain plants that are like the hard liquors of the nectar world. Like clover, that's probably the most popular
Sure.
label that you see on the grocery store shelf. And the reason that is because clover is like the whiskey of the nectar world. You put even 10% whiskey in your glass, and it doesn't matter what else you put in there, you're going to taste whiskey, right? Clover is the same way. You put 10% clover nectar honey in anything else, it's going to taste like clover honey. It's very strong. Buckwheat's another one that's very, very strong in flavor as well. And so you see some of these big, strong flavor ones. But then there's also very subtle flavors also that kind of contribute to the flavor surrounding those main flavors. And so every year it might taste like clover from that specific spot, but then there might be other flowers that are blooming that cause it to taste slightly differently. Like for instance, this year our clover harvest that we have right now is that clean water white. It's super strong in clover flavor, and that's because there wasn't very many other blooming flowers around that area during the clover flow. And so we got a very high percentage of clover honey nectar in that honey, whereas in some years it gets darker and has more amber color to the honey, and it has more nuanced flavors from the other wildflowers that are around the clover.
So sort of going back to the food pairing with it, it is, again, apples and honey holiday time. Do certain honeys in your mind pair better with certain types of apples than others? And you mentioned before we started recording that was your snack last night was apples and honey. What types of apples do you like, and how do you sort of decide which honey you want to try them with?
Oh, so it's been trial and error. As beekeepers, we do pollination services. So we bring our hives to different apple orchards all across the Twin Cities area, the outer metro rings where the apple orchards are, and we pollinate their crops. And so we have a lot of experience in the apple world also. I eat a lot of different kinds of apples. So just off the top of my head, one of my favorites is our lavender blossom honey paired with green apples. Okay. It brings out the floral quality of the green apples. There's the new sweet, was it First Kiss? This is the new apple that's come out right now, and it has like this, like at the base of the apple, it has a red blossom inside the flesh of the apple when you cut it. It's really neat. But it has almost like a rose-like quality, and so when you pair it with our clover honey or our new batch of wildflower that has a lot of clover nectar in it, it really brings out the rose-like flavors of the apple. It's really nice. So I could go on and on. I think there's probably 20-some different kinds of apples that are grown in Minnesota.
Well, and I would say that's sort of the beauty of being in Minnesota, is that you could eat a locally grown apple and find a locally produced honey to sort of pair well and bring out the flavors. But it's interesting that I'm not sure people necessarily think about pairing it the same way. They just find a honey, cut up some apples, and put it on the table. But there are ways to really sort of bump that up a little bit.
Oh yeah, and I have to make a full admission that I'm a food snob. That's how I got into bees. Actually, I used to be a chef.
Really?
And so working in fine dining restaurants across the world, I developed a palate for flavor and a language for that flavor. And this is what my friends and I would talk about when we were sitting down, is like different flavor pairings and how it creates more flavor in your mouth. And so this is like our common discussion. So this is something that is just part of my life. Food has always been part of my life, and as I've grown, it's become more and more institution in my lexicon.
Well, it definitely hit something in your wheelhouse here, for sure.
Right.
Well, Dustin Van Ass and Bear Honey, thank you so much for sponsoring this week and for joining us on this week's podcast. And we will. Well, why don't you tell us real quick, how can people find and where can people find your products?
In the Twin Cities area, you can find us at Hy-Vee, Lund's, Byerly's, Kowalski's, and most of the food co-ops, as well as Festival Foods and many of the local gift shops have our smaller, more unique varieties, as well as the farmers market.
Well, excellent. And check out the Bear Honey website for all of the gift package options if you're looking for a host gift to take to somebody for Rosh Hashanah. This is the perfect time to do it. Dustin, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right. So we're 2 batches into the tasting now. And something I think maybe slightly unexpected happened in the tastings is that, with the First Kiss and then the Macintosh were the apples we tried in the second batch. The First Kiss was as an apple, I think much like the Zestar, really good apple. But not all the honeys worked with it as a pairing. At least that's what I thought.
No, I totally agree. Those were probably my 2 favorite apples on their own of the 4 we've tried so far. So now we've done the Macintosh, the First Kiss, the Granny Smith, and the Zestar. And my 2 least favorite apples I like the best with honeys. This is just bizarre. I'm struggling with what to say because I did not expect any of this to happen.
Well, I think one of the initial things off the First Kiss was that the clover, which I think had been, if not, unanimously our favorite honey through the first 2 apples, at least right up there, was that they almost canceled each other out. Like the honey didn't have the same type of pop as it did with the Granny Smith or even the Zestar, which again on its own is a very, powerful, flavorful apple. And I thought once we got to the Macintosh with both the clover and the linden blossom really shined and really stood out there.
Yeah, I totally agree. The clover and the linden blossom honey is what I think of flavor-wise when I think of honey. One stronger than the other. The linden blossom has a lot more punch to it.
And it has sort of the classical, the classical honey color that you expect to see on the shelves in the store.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I am going to disagree with you slightly here.
Excellent.
The thing that I most despise about apples and or honey is a mushy apple. I just don't want any I want it crisp. I want it clean. And my problem with the Granny Smith and the Macintosh, they were slightly mushy. They were a better vehicle for honey in the sense that they'd let the honey flavors shine through a little bit more. But eating it and chewing it, I much prefer the Zestar or the First Kiss.
So you want a little more 50-50 in terms of apple and honey in terms of consistency. You're not in it just for the honey.
First Kiss so far has been my favorite of all 4 of them, with the combinations included, because I think it let the honey shine a little bit more than the Zestar did, and while maintaining that crisp, bright flavor and texture, really.
Yeah. No, I get that for sure. One of the things that I thought was really interesting out of the second batch was the raw wildflower honey, which I think I was really intrigued with going into the tastings, and when Brett stocked me up with all the honey that we were tasting today. I thought sort of was a little subdued through the first 3 apples, and then the pairing of the Macintosh with that really, to me, jumped out. Like that was sort of a standout to me of the second group.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me about the wildflower honey is the texture of it. It is definitely thicker, a little more crystallized. It's delicious, but the texture is a little bit different. So if we're talking about kind of the combo with everything, if you want that big, long drip of honey coming off your apple when you pull it out on Rosh Hashanah, the wildflower honey is going to be a tougher sell.
Yeah.
And that's the one I have in my pantry every day. I use it all the time. I get what you're saying, though, Bradley, about the texture of the apples, and I agree about the apples, and that's why I like the Zestar and First Kiss on a day-to-day basis. But the Macintosh just had the perfect balance of flavor for me, for not being too tart or too sweet, to let the honey really shine through and just be a good marriage together. Whereas the Granny Smith was just a vessel for the honey, like a pure vessel. Scoop as much as you can, shove it in your mouth, and be happy.
And I think for a lot of people on Rosh Hashanah, that's what they want. They want the vessel for the honey. And that's fine.
Those people are wrong, because mushy apples are terrible.
Okay, they're not mushy, though. They're softer.
Well, it's not like it's a Red Delicious.
Yeah, well, I mean, Red Deliciouses shouldn't even exist.
No, they've been lying to us for our entire lives.
They're
not really delicious at all.
Well, they're red, so they're not totally lying.
Fine, a 50-50 lie. It's still terrible.
I mean, if I think so far, if you want something where you can just dip and go, the Macintosh is probably what you want. Yeah. But if you want something where you're actually going to enjoy the apple as well, not saying the Macintosh is bad, but I'm going to go for the Zestar or the First Kiss any day.
Well, the good news is, in terms of dip and go, we got our last 2 coming up which I think might be the two we've been waiting for in the Honeycrisp and
The Sweet Tango.
and the Sweet Tango. Last two apples in the book, and because we do meticulous research here at We Won Let's Eat, we grouped these two together for a reason. The Sweet Tango and, of course, the Honeycrisp, because why, Matt?
They're Minnesota made. They're both created by David Bedford, who we should really rename the state after. Whoever gave us Honeycrisp deserves all the accolades we could possibly throw at them. So, Mr. David Bedford at the U of M, thank you.
We salute you, sir.
I've already awarded you a Nobel Peace Prize in my heart.
Before we get to the Honeycrisp, though, we start with what we tried first, which was the Sweet Tango, which, again, on its own, really good.
It's not my favorite.
I didn't say it was
It's too
anybody's
tart
favorite.
for me.
Oh,
So
I
it's
don't mind.
not,
I don't mind.
like
the tart.
it, but like it wouldn't be the first 3 or 4 apples I would choose.
It didn't play. It's a good apple. It did not play particularly well with all of the honeys.
With all of them, yeah.
Some
a couple
of
of them it did.
I think the Linden Blossom, I thought,
Everything played well with the Linden Blossom.
yes, Linden Blossom grew on me as we got into our apples.
I actually thought it was really good with the clover honey. The
Yeah.
flavor popped from the clover honey more than it did with a lot of the other apples.
Yeah,
We just ate it not too long ago, and I barely remember it.
That's not good.
that's slightly problematic.
Yeah, well, I've had a lot of honey. True. But I will say that it did... The apple itself did win me over on my mushiness scale.
It did. It was a firm apple.
It was a firm, crisp apple. But in terms of the apple and honey combination, it wasn't my favorite. But it
So-
also wasn't my least favorite.
So Mr. Bedford made the Sweet Tango first before the Honeycrisp, so he clearly learned what worked and what didn't.
Because the Honeycrisp. So before we even get into the honey, the Honeycrisp apple itself might be the perfect apple.
It's a work of art.
I mean, it's the perfect fruit, period. It's not just apples. It is.
Oh,
Wow.
All right. Bold.
If I want to pretend like I'm eating healthy, it makes it awfully easy.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's fair. It worked flawlessly, I might say, with every single one of the honeys we tried.
Including the ones that we wrote off.
Including the Quince Blossom, which, through no fault of its own, did we stop trying apples with. It just didn't play well with apples until the Honeycrisp.
It didn't play great with it, but it was the only one that worked with it at all.
I think I thought it was better. It's not my favorite of the honeys we tried it with, but I think it was definitely the best apple. I mean, the Honeycrisp was the best apple with that particular honey.
Yeah.
It made everything work.
I mean, what else? I don't have anything else to say about it. It was perfect. The other apples, which honey you used, really mattered. The Honeycrisp, it doesn't. Everything played nicely.
And I think the really important thing for the listeners to know is that, we kicked around, we'll let you behind the curtain a little bit. We kicked around how we were going to do this episode. Were we going to eat and taste as we recorded? We decided no, because there was just a lot of moaning noises as we were eating the apple crisp with every honey. And just each dip with each different honey, it just got better.
No one wants to hear us chew either.
That too.
That's not
It's a
pleasant.
bad look. It's not good. But it was, I mean, the Honeycrisp and all of the offerings that, I mean, it's clear Brett Van Ness knows what he's doing at Bear Honey, because, I mean, he knew what he was picking when I said, hey, we're going to taste it with a bunch of different apples. He gave us some options, and the man knows what he's doing.
They were all great.
They were all great.
Yeah. Hands down. It is worth getting good local honey. You taste the difference, and you get to support a local business in the meantime. So,
And
if for some reason you don't choose Honeycrisp for your Rosh Hashanah table, still go buy some Bear Honey. The Clover and the Linden Blossom worked with just about everything we tried.
And I'd like to think that we tried enough apples that we should have given you plenty of options for your Rosh Hashanah table to choose from, because we care about you, our listeners.
But there is only one right option, and it's the Honeycrisp.
Yep, and we're done here.
Yeah, that's going to do it. So, with that in mind, thank you for listening. Again, enjoy your Rosh Hashanah. We will be back soon. We are going to be talking about Yom Kippur, which obviously, you don't eat on Yom Kippur, but make sure you listen to that episode, and we'll get into what about it. And the food is great. Thank you so much for listening. For Matt and Bradley, we will see you soon. We Won Let's Eat, the Jewish Food Podcast, is a product of Jewfolk Inc. You can email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com or find Fancy Dinner Club on Instagram at Fancy Dinner Club. Music for the show is from Dan Israel and his newest studio album, Social Media Anxiety Disorder. Check out his album release show on October 4th and get more information at danisraelmusic.com.